The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of Parliament. House's Captain James Richardson adjusted his ceremonial uniform. He had been a royal guard for 12 years, and today was supposed to be like any other day of duty. The grand building stood tall and proud, its columns reaching toward the sky like ancient sentinels. Politicians and staff members hurried past him, their minds focused on the day's important debates and decisions. James stood at attention near the main entrance, his polished boots reflecting the morning light. He watched as black cars pulled up one after another, dropping off members of Parliament in their finest suits. The air buzzed with anticipation because today was special. The Prime Minister would be presenting a new bill about children's welfare and education reform. Camera crews had set up their equipment, and reporters clutched their notepads, ready to capture every moment. As James scanned the crowd, something unusual caught his eye. A small figure was moving through the sea of adults, weaving between legs and briefcases. It was a little girl, no more than 7 years old, with tangled brown hair and a dress that had seen better days. Her shoes were worn and muddy, and she clutched a crumpled piece of paper in her tiny hand. She looked lost and frightened, her big brown eyes darting around the imposing building. The girl stumbled on the steps, nearly falling. Without thinking, James broke from his position and rushed toward her. He caught her just before she hit the hard stone. Her body was trembling, and he could feel how thin she was beneath her threadbare clothes. When she looked up at him, tears were streaming down her dirty cheeks. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. James knelt down to her level, his stern guard expression softening into concern. The little girl's lips were chapped, and she looked like she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. She kept glancing over her shoulder, fear evident in every movement. He noticed bruises on her arms, partially hidden by her long sleeves. Something was terribly wrong. Every instinct told him this child needed help immediately. The girl tugged on his uniform and whispered, something so quietly that James had to lean closer to hear. What she said made his blood run cold. She wasn't lost. She had come here on purpose, walking miles through the city streets to reach this place. She had a message, something urgent, that she believed only the most important people in the country could help with. Her small hand gripped the paper tighter, and James could see writing on it. Though the letters were shaky and childish, security guards nearby noticed the commotion and started walking toward them. James knew they would simply escort the girl away, treat her as a distraction or a security concern. But looking into her desperate eyes, he made a decision that would break protocol, but might save a life. He scooped the little girl into his arms, feeling her relax slightly against his chest. She was so light, weighing almost nothing. The other guards called out to him, questioning what he was doing. James ignored them and walked purposefully toward the main doors of Parliament. The girl buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with silent sobs. He could feel her heart beating rapidly like a frightened bird. Whatever had brought her here, whatever she needed to say, James was determined that someone would listen. The massive wooden doors loomed ahead. Beyond them lay the seat of power where decisions that affected millions were made every day. Today, those decision-makers would hear from someone whose voice was usually ignored. James pushed through the heavy doors with the little girl still in his arms. The grand entrance hall stretched before them, all polished marble and crystal chandeliers. Voices echoed off the high ceilings as Parliament members gathered in small groups discussing the day's agenda. Several people stopped mid-conversation to stare at the unusual sight of a royal guard carrying a dirty, crying child through their pristine halls. A senior official rushed toward them, his face red with indignation. He demanded to know what James thought he was doing, bringing an unauthorized person into the building. Security protocols existed for a reason, he barked. James stood his ground, explaining that this was an emergency. The little girl needed help, and she had specifically come here seeking it. The official waved his hand dismissively, insisting the proper channels were social services, not Parliament. But James refused to back down. He had seen something in the girl's eyes, heard the desperation in her whisper. This wasn't about following rules anymore. It was about doing what was right. The commotion was drawing more attention now. Staff members peered out from offices, and a few reporters who had been setting up inside caught wind of the unusual scene. Their cameras started rolling, capturing the standoff between the decorated guard and the government official. Little girl lifted her head from James's shoulder and looked around. At all the fancy decorations and important-looking people, she seemed overwhelmed by the grandeur of it all, but she didn't ask to be put down. Instead, she whispered something else to James, and he nodded solemnly. She wanted to see the Prime Minister. She had walked all this way because she believed the leader of the country could help her and others like her. James made his way deeper into the building, the official trailing behind him, still protesting loudly. Other guards approached, unsure whether to stop their colleague or let him continue. James's reputation as a dedicated and honorable guard gave them pause. He wasn't known for breaking rules without good reason. The main chamber was just ahead, where Parliament was about to convene for the day's session. As they reached the entrance to the chamber, more security personnel blocked their path. They couldn't allow this disruption, they insisted. The Prime Minister was about to begin an important presentation. James looked down at the girl in his arms. Her eyes pleaded with him not to give up. She had been brave enough to come all this way alone. He had to be brave enough to see this through. Taking a deep breath, James called out in his clear, a commanding voice that this child had something important to say, and that it related directly to the children's welfare bill being discussed today. His words carried through the corridor, reaching the ears of several Parliament members who were filing into the chamber. One older woman, a representative known for her work with disadvantaged children, stopped and turned around. She walked back toward them, curiosity and concern on her face. The representative asked the little girl her name. The child whispered it so softly that the woman had to lean in close. Her name was Emma. The representative then asked what had brought her here. Emma held up the crumpled paper, her hand shaking. On it were names, dozens of them, written in different handwriting styles. Some were neat, others barely legible. The representative took the paper carefully and began to read. Her expression changed from curiosity to shock, then to something that looked like anger mixed with deep sadness. She looked at James and told him to follow her immediately. The other officials started to object, but she silenced them with a sharp look. She was a senior member of Parliament, and her word carried weight. Together, they walked into the chamber, where members were taking their seats. The Prime Minister stood at the podium, shuffling his notes, preparing to speak. When he looked up and saw a royal guard carrying a small child down the aisle, followed by the senior representative, his expression showed complete confusion. The entire chamber fell silent, all eyes turning to witness this unprecedented interruption. The Prime Minister gripped the edges of the podium, clearly stunned by what was unfolding before him. Parliament had procedures, traditions that went back centuries. Nothing like this had ever happened during his tenure. Security officers appeared at the chamber doors, waiting for his signal to remove the intruders. But something made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the way the little girl looked at him, or the serious expression on the senior representative's face. He raised his hand, signaling everyone to wait. James carried Emma down the center aisle, his boots echoing in the silent chamber. Every seat was filled with Parliament members, all of them watching this strange procession. Emma's fingers clutched James's uniform tightly. She had never been in a place like this, surrounded by so many powerful people. The ceiling seemed impossibly high above her, decorated with paintings of historical moments. Rich wooden benches lined both sides, and the air smelled of old books and furniture polish. When they reached the front, James gently set Emma down on her feet, but he stayed close beside her. His presence gave her courage. The Prime Minister stepped down from the podium and approached them slowly. He was a tall man in an expensive suit, his gray hair perfectly styled. Up close, Emma could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of long years in office. He knelt down on one knee so he could look at her directly, something that surprised everyone watching. He asked Emma in a gentle voice why she had come to Parliament. Emma's voice was still barely a whisper, and the Prime Minister had to lean closer to hear her. She told him about the place where she lived, a children's home on the outskirts of the city. She described how the man who ran it was mean and cruel. The children there never got enough food, she said, and they were punished harshly for the smallest mistakes. Some of the younger kids were sick, but no doctor ever came to see them. The chamber remained absolutely silent as Emma spoke. Parliament members leaned forward in their seats, straining to hear her quiet words. The senior representative stepped forward and handed the crumpled paper to the Prime Minister. He stood up and read it, his face growing pale. These were names of children, Emma explained. All of them lived at the home. They had each signed the paper, some just making marks because they couldn't write properly yet. It was their way of asking for help. Emma continued her story, telling how she had decided someone important needed to know what was happening. The other children were too scared to leave, afraid of what might happen if they were caught. But Emma had waited until everyone was asleep 3 nights ago and had snuck out. She had walked during the day and hidden at night, following signs and asking kind strangers for directions to Parliament. She had eaten from trash bins and slept in doorways. All because she believed that if the right people knew the truth, they would do something to help. The Prime Minister looked shaken. He asked Emma if she was telling the truth, if conditions at the home were really that bad. Emma nodded and then did something that made several Parliament members gasp. She rolled up her sleeve to show the bruises on her arm. These weren't from playing or accidents. They were in the distinct shape of adult fingers, marks left by someone gripping her too hard. She turned and lifted the back of her shirt slightly, revealing more marks across her back. The evidence was undeniable and heartbreaking. A woman in the chamber started crying quietly. Others looked angry, their faces flushed with emotion. The Prime Minister stood up straight, his jaw set in determination. He asked Emma for the name and location of the children's home. She told him everything she remembered, including the name of the man who ran it. The Prime Minister turned to his assistants and began giving orders rapidly. He wanted social services contacted immediately, police sent to the location, and a full investigation launched before the day was over. Emma swayed slightly on her feet, exhaustion finally catching up with her. James quickly steadied her, his hand on her shoulder. The Prime Minister noticed and called for someone to bring water and food. Within moments, staff members rushed in with a chair, a bottle of water, and some biscuits from the Parliament cafeteria. Emma sat down gratefully and took small sips of water, her hand still shaking. The Prime Minister knelt beside her again and made her a promise in front of everyone assembled. He promised that she and all the children whose names were on that paper would be safe by tonight. No child would go back to that place. The Prime Minister stood and addressed the entire chamber, his voice strong and clear. He announced that the children's welfare bill they had planned to discuss would be postponed. What was happening right now was more important than any prepared speech or political debate. A child had risked everything to bring them the truth, and they had a responsibility to act on it immediately. He declared that Emma's courage had exposed a failure in their system, a blind spot that had allowed children to suffer while they debated policy in comfortable chambers. Several Parliament members stood and applauded, the sound filling the grand room. Others wiped tears from their eyes. The senior representative who had helped James and Emma walked to the podium and took the microphone. She explained that cases like Emma's were likely not isolated. For years, she had been trying to get more funding for oversight of children's homes and foster care facilities. Her proposals had always been pushed down the priority list, considered less urgent than other matters. Now, everyone could see the consequences of that neglect. Within 30 minutes, the chamber had transformed into a command center. Parliament members were making phone calls, contacting officials in social services, health departments, and law enforcement. The Prime Minister had assigned a special task force to investigate not just Emma's children's home, but every similar facility in the country. He wanted surprise inspections, interviews with children in private settings, and a complete review of how these institutions were monitored and funded. Emma sat in the chair, eating the biscuit slowly, still processing what was happening. She had hoped someone would listen. But she had never imagined that the most powerful people in the country would drop everything to help. James stood beside her like a protective guardian, refusing to leave her side. When a medical officer arrived to examine Emma's injuries, James held her hand while the doctor gently checked her bruises and cuts. The doctor's report was grim. Emma was malnourished, dehydrated, and showed signs of prolonged physical abuse. She would need immediate medical care and counseling. News of what was happening inside Parliament had spread quickly. Outside the building, television crews and journalists were gathering in large numbers. The few reporters who had been inside when Emma arrived had captured footage of the royal guard carrying her through the halls. That footage was now being broadcast on every news channel. People across the country stopped what they were doing to watch. Social media exploded with reactions. How had this been allowed to happen? Why hadn't the authorities known? The hashtag Emma's bravery started trending within the hour. Back in the chamber, the Prime Minister was on the phone with the police commissioner. He wanted officers sent to the children's home immediately, but he insisted they bring social workers and child psychologists with them. The children had been through enough trauma. They needed to be removed from the facility carefully and taken somewhere safe and welcoming. The commissioner assured him that his best people were already on their way, with emergency accommodations being arranged at a proper children's care facility that had been thoroughly vetted. Emma suddenly spoke up, her voice still quiet but firmer than before. She asked, what would happen to the other children? Would they be split up? They were like a family to each other, she explained. They had protected each other and shared what little they had. The Prime Minister paused, considering her words. He turned to the senior representative and asked if there was a facility large enough and good enough to keep all the children together, at least temporarily, until proper, permanent placements could be found for each child based on their individual needs. The representative made several calls and found a solution. There was a newly renovated youth center on the other side of the city that had been preparing to open next month. It had dormitories, a medical wing, counseling rooms, kitchen capable of feeding hundreds, and even classrooms and play areas. The director of the center agreed immediately to open early for emergency use. The facility would welcome all the children from Emma's home, providing them with food, medical care, clean clothes, and most importantly, safety and kindness. Emma's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different. These were tears of relief and hope. She had carried the weight of all those children on her small shoulders for so long, afraid that her mission might fail, that no one would believe her or care. Now she could see that people did care, and they were taking real action. James squeezed her shoulder gently and told her she had done something incredibly brave. She had saved her friends and probably countless other children who would benefit from the reforms that were now being set in motion. The Prime Minister received a call informing him that police and social workers had arrived at the children's home. The man who ran it had been taken into custody, and all 23 children were being safely transported to the youth center. Medical teams were standing by to examine each child. None of them had been seriously injured during the rescue operation, though several were scared and confused. Social workers were explaining gently that they were going somewhere better, somewhere safe, and that a brave girl named Emma had made sure they would be helped. Emma asked if she could see her friends, and the Prime Minister promised she would be taken to them soon. But first he wanted to make sure she received medical attention and had a proper meal. A kind woman from Parliament's staff offered to take Emma to a private room where she could rest, clean up, and eat something more substantial than biscuits. James asked if he could accompany them, and the Prime Minister nodded his approval. The guard had shown exceptional judgment and compassion today, acting beyond his duty to help a child in need as Emma was being led away to rest. The Prime Minister called for the Parliament session to officially reconvene. He needed to address what had happened and outline the immediate steps being taken. Cameras were allowed into the chamber, something that was done only for the most significant moments in the nation's history. The Prime Minister began his speech by acknowledging that the system had failed Emma and the other children. He took responsibility on behalf of the government for not having better oversight and protections in place. He announced a series of immediate actions. All children's homes and care facilities would undergo unannounced inspections starting immediately. A hotline would be established where children could report abuse anonymously. Funding for child welfare services would be increased significantly, and new laws would be drafted to ensure stricter licensing requirements and regular monitoring of anyone working with vulnerable children. The Children's Welfare Bill would be rewritten to include much stronger protections based on what they had learned today. The Prime Minister also announced that Emma would be honored for her bravery. She had done what many adults failed to do, standing up against injustice despite personal risk. He proposed creating an award in her name that would recognize young people who showed extraordinary courage in helping others. The chamber erupted in applause again. Some members wiped away tears. This was why they had gone into public service. To make a real difference in people's lives, especially those who couldn't advocate for themselves. Meanwhile, in a quiet office upstairs, Emma sat at a table with James beside her. A doctor had cleaned and bandaged her wounds. She wore clean clothes that a staff member had rushed out to buy, and she was eating a warm bowl of soup with fresh bread. It was the best meal she had eaten in years. She ate slowly, savoring every bite. James watched her with a mixture of sadness and admiration. This little girl had shown more courage than most soldiers he had served with. Emma asked James why he had helped her. He could have just sent her away like the other guards wanted to do. James thought for a moment before answering. He told her that when he looked into her eyes, he saw the same determination he had seen in soldiers fighting for something they believed in. She was fighting for her friends, for children who had no voice. How could he not help someone with a cause that pure and important? Emma smiled for the first time that day, a small but genuine smile that transformed her tired face. The social worker arrived to talk with Emma about what would happen next. She explained gently that Emma would stay at the youth center with her friends. They figured out the best long-term situation for each child. Some might have family members who could take them in once the situation was properly investigated. Others might be placed with carefully screened foster families. But throughout the process, Emma and her friends would receive counseling, education, and all the care they needed. The nightmare was over. Emma asked one more question that showed her maturity beyond her years. She wanted to know if this would help other children too, not just the ones from her home. The social worker assured her that yes, because of her bravery, thousands of children across the country would be safer. New laws would be passed, new systems put in place. Emma's actions today would create ripples that would protect vulnerable children for generations to come. Emma nodded, satisfied that her long walk and scary journey had been worth it. Later that afternoon, a car with tinted windows pulled up to a side entrance of Parliament. Emma would be taken to the youth center to reunite with her friends. James insisted on accompanying her, having received special permission to leave his post for the day. The Prime Minister himself came down to see her off. He knelt down once more and thanked Emma personally. He told her that she had taught them all an important lesson about courage and doing what was right. No matter how frightening it seemed, Emma hugged the Prime Minister, surprising him and the security detail around them. Then she took James's hand, and together they walked to the waiting car. As they drove through the city's streets toward the youth center, Emma looked out the window at the normal world going by. People walking their dogs, shoppers carrying bags, children playing in parks. It all seemed different now, brighter somehow. She had been so scared during her journey to Parliament, but she had found help. She had found people who cared. The youth center was nothing like the old children's home. When Emma walked through the doors, she was greeted by bright colors, clean floors, and the smell of fresh paint and cooking food. Staff members smiled warmly at her, and there was soft music playing somewhere in the background. James stayed close to her as a counselor gave them a tour. There were comfortable bedrooms with real beds and clean sheets. Bathrooms that actually worked properly. A dining hall with tables and chairs that weren't broken. And even a library filled with books. Then Emma heard voices she recognized. Her friends were gathered in a large common room, sitting on couches and beanbags, some with blankets wrapped around them. When they saw Emma, several of them jumped up and ran to her. They hugged her tightly, all talking at once. They had been so worried about her when she disappeared. Some thought she had been caught and punished. Others hoped she had escaped to something better. None of them had imagined she had walked all the way to Parliament and actually made the important people listen. The children gathered around Emma as she told them what had happened. Their eyes grew wide as she described the grand building, the Parliament members and the Prime Minister himself kneeling down to hear her story. She showed them her bandaged arms and told them how doctors had been kind and gentle. She explained that they were all safe now, that the mean man from the old home was in jail. and that they would never have to go back there. Some of the younger children started crying with relief. Older ones stood quietly, letting the news sink in. Hardly daring to believe it was real, James watched the reunion from a respectful distance, his eyes misting up despite his military training. These children had suffered so much, yet they still had the capacity to care for each other, to feel joy and hope. A counselor approached him and thanked him for what he had done. Without his willingness to break protocol and trust Emma, none of this might have happened. Those children might have continued suffering in silence. James shook his head modestly and said Emma deserved all the credit. She was the brave one. He had just done what anyone with a heart should do. Over the following weeks, Emma and her friends adjusted to their new life. They attended classes with patient teachers who understood they had gaps in their education. They saw counselors who helped them process their trauma. They ate 3 meals a day, every day, with snacks available whenever they were hungry. They played in a safe outdoor area and learned what it felt like to just be children without fear. Slowly, their bruises healed, they gained healthy weight, and their smiles came more easily. The story of Emma's brave walk to Parliament became national news. People were moved by her courage and appalled by what she had endured. Donations poured into child welfare organizations. Volunteers signed up to mentor vulnerable children. The government passed the new child protection laws with overwhelming support from all political parties. It became known as Emma's Law, ensuring that no child in care would ever again slip through the cracks of the system without someone noticing and acting. James visited Emma regularly at the youth center, bringing books and games. He had become something like a guardian figure to her, though the relationship was unofficial. Emma had started calling him Captain James, and she would tell the other children stories about how he had carried her into Parliament like a hero from a storybook. James always corrected her gently, reminding her that she was the hero of this story. He had just been there to help. 6 months after that remarkable day, Emma stood on a stage in the same Parliament building where her journey had begun. She wore a pretty blue dress. Her hair was clean and styled, and she looked healthy and strong. The Prime Minister was presenting her with a special medal for civilian bravery, the youngest person ever to receive such an honor. The chamber was packed with Parliament members, journalists, and special guests. James stood nearby in his dress uniform, beaming with pride. Emma gave a short speech that had been written with help from her counselors. But the words she spoke were truly her own. She thanked everyone who had helped her and her friends. She thanked James for believing in her when he could have easily turned her away. She thanked the Prime Minister for listening and taking action. But mostly, she spoke about the other children who were still out there, in situations that might be hidden from view. She asked everyone to be watchful, to be kind, and to speak up when they saw something wrong. Even small voices could create big changes, she said. If people were willing to listen, the audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Many people were crying openly, moved by her words and her incredible journey from frightened, abused child to confident advocate for others. After the ceremony, Emma was reunited with some of her friends who had come to watch. They were being placed in carefully selected foster homes and group settings, but they stayed in touch with each other. The bonds they had formed during their difficult times remained strong. As for Emma, a loving couple who had followed her story came forward to offer her a permanent home. They were thoroughly vetted by social services, and Emma met with them several times before agreeing to the placement. They had a house with a garden, a room that would be all hers, and most importantly, genuine warmth and love to give. Emma moved in with them, and for the first time in her life, she learned what it felt like to be part of a real family. Years later, Emma would go on to study social work and child advocacy in university. She never forgot where she came from, or the children who had suffered alongside her. She dedicated her life to helping others find their voices and ensuring that vulnerable children had protections and opportunities. The little girl who had once walked alone through city streets to Parliament had grown into a powerful force for change, proving that courage has no age limit and that one person really can make a difference in the world. And Captain James Richardson, who had trusted his instincts and carried a frightened child into the halls of power, remained a dear friend and mentor, always proud to have played a small part in Emma's remarkable story.